Hello and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson, and I am joined today by Iain McKay. We're going to discuss
McKay.
Iain
McKay.
McKay. I'm joined today by Iain McKay. Is it Scottish?
It's Scottish, yes.
Scottish, yeah. So my Culbertson is also Scottish, but my family has left a long time ago.
Oh, no, don't worry. I live in England now, so I'm getting used to it. But yeah.
Okay. My guest today is Iain McKay, and we are discussing the recent publication of this book by Kropotkin called Words of a Rebel, which has never before been available in English in its entirety, even though it contains some of Kropotkin's most famous writing. And Iain, for my introduction before he gets to introduce himself, Iain has been translating and editing Kropotkin's work in these amazing anthologies, as well as individual editions for both AK Press and PM Press. In fact, Iain, I'm going to be featuring Modern Science and Anarchy in a few months with a philosopher of science at Kent State. So that's coming along as well. So your work, Iain, is just huge for those of us who are interested in Kropotkin. So thank you for doing this work for us.
I'm happy to. I like Kropotkin. He's a very good writer. Well, I have to say that when I became an anarchist, I didn't really rate Kropotkin that highly. It took a few years before I sort of sunk in sort of how good a writer and how important he was. To some context, initially, I kind of dismissed him as like the the gentle prince of cooperation stuff, the picture people present of him, but as I sort of drilled into it, sort of read more and more of his things, it's like, actually, that's very unfair. He's much more than that, and I've now got a better idea of sort of why he was so venerated by the movement. Which was a problem actually, because they ended up sort of hero worshipping, and obviously when he supported the Allies in like 1914, that blew up in everybody's face quite quickly. So it's a case of, yes, he's important. He's a very important writer, very important thinker, but yes, let's not put him on a pedestal, because we did that before and we live to regret it.
Yes, so I'm doing right now a series called Anarchism 101. That's a lot of the introduction to great thinkers in one of their texts. And it is sort of the entire project. I mean, this project, Iain, the Anarchism 101 came not from me, but from my listeners. They wanted this sort of anarchist canon. And it's lovely. And I'm also very uncomfortable with the idea of an anarchist canon and this idea, this sort of, I'm creating yet another like sort of stable grand narrative. First came Proudhon, who was great, but not great enough, and Bakunin was a step forward, and then Kropotkin always ends up kind of the like flowering, the perfect figure. And this is, of course, an absurd thing to say about a person, especially an anarchist. And yet it's so easy to do that with him because of his central role and his amazing writing.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the thing, though. It's like my favorite dead anarchist has always been Enrico Malatesta. And sort of in terms of his contribution, luckily AK Press are doing his collected works, which is making sort of filling a very big hole in our understanding of the evolution of anarchist theory. But yes, you're right, we have to be careful, because the idea like Proudhon is better, Bakunin's better than Proudhon, Kropotkin's better than Bakunin, and it's not as straightforward as that. People have good points, bad points. Some people stress things better than others, argue the case better than others, and it's a case of understanding anarchism in all its many facets and all its many thinkers and so forth. And yes, we have to get away from looking at the great men, and it's always usually the great men. The great women usually don't get a look in unless it's Emma Goldman, but that's changing. But these are important writers and important thinkers, and they can't ignore them, but we have to put them in context, because ultimately Kropotkin would not be being read now if it went for all the anarchists around the world who were doing things and making their own contributions. All the unsung people who is like, the names appear, if they're lucky, in the papers, which are in an archive. But they're the people who made Kropotkin relevant. If he was just by himself, he would just be, nobody would listen, nobody would read him now, because it'd be like completely just a single thinker. Doesn't have that much of an impact. He was part of a movement. He was very much, for the first 20 years of his time in the movement, he didn't sign his articles. So it's a case of, there will never be a complete bibliography of his writings, because he didn't identify himself. He was just one comrade among many. And he definitely, one of the things he said when he visited the Jura Federation in 1872, one of the things that drew him to anarchism was precisely there wasn't this leader-led thing going on. Everybody were comrades together. Everybody made their contribution. We were not like we weren't putting people on pedestals. Bakunin was just another comrade, and that's what attracted him to anarchism. And obviously, and fittingly enough, we should view Kropotkin as another comrade, rather than putting him on a pedestal. Yes, he was important. He wrote very important books, but he is part of a movement, and he's important because he's part of a movement. And he became so famous and so influential because he articulated what the movement was doing and thinking. And you can see that the moment he sided with the imperialist powers in 1914, his influence disappeared, because he was no longer articulating the anarchist movement's ideas anymore. He basically went off on his own, and he was isolated. Malatesta fought the battle and articulated the anarchist position. And when finally when Russia went out of the war in 1918 and Kropotkin started sort of talking sense again, people started listening again. People visited him in Russia. Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, the Italian syndicalists and so forth, who all visited in Russia, all visited him to get his ideas on it. And it's important to articulate, the idea of these sages and so forth. Well, yes, they're important, but they're only important because they articulated what the movement was arguing. They influenced that, obviously, but the movement influenced what they were arguing too. So it's a interactive process, and we should bear that in mind. And yes, so we have to get away from the great men. It's almost always great men, but and view them as like embedded within a movement. And the reason why they're famous is because they articulated what the movement was doing better than others. But ultimately, Kropotkin was a comrade among comrades, and when he was wrong, people pointed it out.
Yeah. Well, in the case of World War I, Emma Goldman and many others were quite willing to point out when he was wrong. Oh, yes, that's wonderful. It's wonderful to be reminded of. I mean, one of the very first interviews I did was with the author Leonard Williams, and one of the first things he said when I was asking about his book was like, "This, my name is on this book, but so many people were involved in making this a reality." And when you think about this book, Words of a Rebel, was originally newspaper articles. You can imagine this sort of in this romantic way. You can have the illusion that an author goes somewhere and writes a book and hands it to the publisher, and the publisher just does menial work or whatever. But it's impossible to imagine that for a newspaper. If there's other, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, in terms of Words of a Rebel, Kropotkin was actually in prison in France. When it was being put together. His comrade Reclus, his fellow geographer, Elise Reclus, he was the editor. He put those articles together. He did the book. So Kropotkin was in prison at the time. So yes, it's a collective work. Obviously, it's like articles from a newspaper. He didn't produce that himself. The actual bringing them together, getting the publisher and all that was done when he was in prison. So it's very much a collective project. Similarly, with his other books, Conquest of Bread was also a collection of articles initially brought together by Reclus again. This time, Kropotkin was in exile in Britain, not in prison. But again, it's like as a collective project. Similarly, with Modern Science and Anarchy, slightly different because it was initially based on a Russian pamphlet and lectures and so forth. It's not all from newspapers, but it was a collaborative project coming from different lectures and pamphlets, revised and published in the Thames Nouveau. But again, a collective project. And these are all collective projects. That's an important thing to remember.
Yes, wonderful. Excellent. I next wanted to talk about sort of like where Words of the Rebel stands. I know we were talking before we started recording that Kropotkin says that Words of a Rebel is really part of like a two-part series. It's sort of a prelude or a first part to Conquest of Bread. And if you do know anything about the anarchist movement, you know that Conquest of Bread, I don't know if this is true, but the legend is that they had Conquest of Bread, the anarchists did, on them in the Spanish Civil War. Like, you sort of marched to war with a rifle and a canteen and the book Conquest of Bread. So we've got this book that Kropotkin at least placed right along Conquest of Bread in its importance. So I'm curious what you think of Kropotkin's theory. How does this book fit in with Conquest of Bread, if that's true, and if it should be remembered sort of side by side?
Yes, he says this. He says as much in his memoirs. He said, like, he basically said that, like, Words of a Rebel is the destructive, the critical part of the two volumes, if you like. It's his analysis and critique of the current society. Well, the Conquest of Bread is the constructive part, as in, like, what we should be doing if it's when a revolution breaks out. How should we act? And the final chapter of Words of a Rebel is expropriation, and that's what bridges the two works, because essentially after a couple of sort of short introductory chapters about anarchist communism and sort of our riches, the bulk of the book is about expropriation and talking about, if the Paris Commune happen again, what lessons have we learned? What should we do to make sure that the economic transformation we need happens? So so Words of a Rebel is fundamentally a critique of capitalism, of the state. He talks about the breakdown of a state. He talks about representing the government, the critique of representing the government. He talks about the critique, it's like appeal to the young, basically, sort of talking about, why everybody, young at heart. He's not talking about just young people, it's like young at heart. He says so much in the pamphlet. It's like, if you're a doctor or an engineer, or, how capitalism corrupts your aspirations to make the world a better place. Obviously it goes about working class people as well. And he basically presents, this is capitalism, this is why it needs to be changed. He talks about, like, the necessity of revolution. He talks about, like, the system's corrupt and there needs to be a fundamental change. And he explains why, voting won't do it. And he explains, like, sort of the institutional pressures involved, the breaks and so forth that go on. And so the first part of, so essentially he is right, the first part was of a rebel is essentially the critique of capitalism, and the Conquest of Bread is the constructive, like, what should we do to replace this system with something better? And it's right, there's two parts of this, of essentially the same project. And I would say that the major drawback between the two volumes, there should have been really a third volume, which really talks about how we get to the revolution. So that part is kind of like, sort of not really talked about. It's mentioned in passing a couple of times. And that's why in the new edition, I included various articles about the labour movement and as supplementary material. As I did with Modern Science and Anarchy, I added some extra supplementary material to that to put some more context in. So I sort of tried to draw the sort of bring articles forth where sort of try to link the here and then, if you see what I mean. So what do we do in the meantime? And that hopefully will sort of show that Kropotkin's not some sort of airy dreamer who just thinks about the distant future, or like, well, once the revolution comes, what do we do now? And that's important because that's kind of been obscured. And that's part of sort of why part of the reason why Kropotkin's got this sort of reputation as being a sort of anarcho Santa, if you know what I mean. not only the beard, but and giving away stuff free. But it's a case of like
Kenna was on Santa. So I have done the anarcho Santa thing, but it was not just that. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No. But so it's a case of, it's important to sort of, he was engaged with the movement and the needs of the movement and the labour movement. So he did write a lot of articles. Most of them haven't been translated. A lot of the stuff first appeared in Direct Struggle Against Capital, the anthology I created. And it's a case of that helps put it in context. So it's a very important book because some of his most famous writings are in it, like Appeal to the Young, for example. His articles on the some of his articles in the Past Commune. He wrote about Past Commune a lot, but the famous pamphlet on the Past Commune. A lot of stuff was translated and appeared in anarchist pamphlets or in the anarchist press, but no, the book itself was not translated until 1992, when Black Rose did a version of it for their collected works of Kropotkin project to mark his when was it, 1992? So it'd be 150 years from his birth. Right. Yeah. But that version didn't include the Italian preface or the Russian preface or postface, so it missed out bits. And it wasn't very well translated. Because I was doing I've been working. It's not out yet, but I'm doing a libertarian reader, which includes libertarians, there's a libertarian Marxists, anarchists, guild socialists, syndicalists, and so forth. A quite a wide ranging. And I wanted to include some Kropotkin. I wanted to include political rights from the Was of a Rebel. And I thought, well, I better retranslate it because I don't want to get into. I don't want to step on Black Rose's toes. And I realised, when I was doing that, actually, this translation is not as good as it could be. And so I thought, okay, and I contacted PM Press, and they said, oh yeah, we'll go for that. So it's a case of so that was the motivation for it, for doing this, because it contains a lot of important writings. About half a book maybe was translated in various pamphlets and articles and so forth, but the whole thing has never been translated. Including the prefaces and the postface. And so it's his first book, and ironically, it's the last book to be fully translated into English.
Again, I think it's so important to understand. I mean, something that he writes maybe in one of the letters in the book, or maybe one of the prefaces, is that books are not that important to the anarchist movement, at least in that moment, because it's intellectuals, it's people like me that read books, and he is so much more interested in reaching workers and reaching laborers with pamphlets and newspapers. And then he says, sort of offhandedly, something like, but I suppose there are some people who will find it more easily in a book, and so we might as well have a book. But that is so far from the first his thought.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, he explicitly says in his memoirs, he wrote in a way which is accessible to ordinary people. And you can tell by his writings, because you read some, particularly Marxist stuff, and it's just going like, God, this is hard going. They use a lot of jargon, they use a lot of terminology. And some of it, I think, is not actually because, I think they do it just to make himself look important. And it's just like, well, if you can't explain it in a sort of a way anybody can understand, then you failed. I think Lenin said that the only way you can understand capital is if you read Hegel's Philosophy of Right or something like that. If you read Hegel, you're like, if that is true, then Karl Marx is an awful writer, because if you have to read German philosophy to understand what Karl Marx was writing, then he's failed as a writer. So Kropotkin is very keen in basically making his ideas as accessible as possible. Because ultimately, it's like, he knew the working class would be the people who would be interested in a revolution, not the elite. It's like, the ones who are oppressed and exploited are the ones who've got an interest in ending both. And he deliberately wrote in a way which is accessible. So he tried to make his ideas as complex as, the complex ideas as simple as possible, not simplistic, but as straightforward and as clear as possible. And that's important. And that's one of the great joys of Kropotkin. He didn't put in his didn't put on all the jargon. He didn't put in dialectics and all that nonsense. He just wrote clearly. And so that's why you'll never have a book called What Kropotkin Really Meant, like you have with What Marx Really Meant, because you read it and you understand exactly what he meant. And the problem is that a lot of Marxist particular commentaries on Kropotkin are written by people who haven't read him, and which just you regurgitate what other Marxists have said about him. Because if you actually read him, you realise that vast 90% of what's said, criticism of him, are not actually true. He's like, evolution, and he believed in cooperation, altruism, and all that. No, if you read the subtitle of Mutuate, it's a factor of evolution. You just have to read the subtitle, because it's like, these people don't even get beyond the subtitle. They don't even get beyond the title. They don't even get to the subtitle. And they're going on about how he didn't recognise, we need for competition and people being nasty to each other. Read the bloody book. It's like he's very clear about all this. It's a factor of evolution. And it's similarly with was a rebel. It's a case of a lot of his stuff in there. It's a case of yeah, he's very clear. It's very clear the class struggle exists. He's very clear that he's fighting for the emancipation of the working classes, peasantry, workers, artisans, and it's all very much a case of he's addressing the common person and saying and trying to infuse hope. And he's very clear. It's like hope is what makes revolutions, and his book is very much a case of look, you've been exploited and oppressed, but look, something's better there. There's tendencies in the world that show there's something better, and we build on these tendencies. And that's one of the most important parts of the book. He draws out things like the commune and sort of free association, and the importance of federalism and so forth. And that sort of positive message comes through. It's not the main part of the book, but he draws that out, and obviously goes into more detail and things like in the Conquest of Bread and Modern Science and Anarchy. But one of the benefits of the book, one of the joys of the book, is that he combines critique with an analysis of the tendencies within capitalism which point beyond it. And he says, no, we're not crazy people. Look, these things are going on now. Federalism, those sort of associations. It's like we don't have to do things in a centralized manner. Scientists work together in a decentralized federal manner. Why don't we do that of everything? It works. It works here. The Red Cross works. Sort of National Life, the Lifeboat Association in Britain works. So we can do things in a better way. These within capitalism point beyond it, and we have to encourage those tendencies.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, when you're talking about evolution, just to add, Darwin also mentions cooperation, but I think most of the people who say that Darwin says everything is competition have also not read Darwin. I mean, it's astonishing to me.
Kropotkin says exactly the same thing. He goes here's Darwin on cooperation. It's like he rightly considered himself a Darwinist. He really believed in survival of the fittest. He argued that quite rightly that the groups which cooperate are better suited for survival. They'll live longer. They'll have more offspring. The offspring will survive better than if everybody's fighting and stabbing each other in the back. And you think, when you put it that way, it's like, and Darwin was right, Kropotkin was right. It's like, and the fact that Darwin has been distorted so much says more about the society we live in than it says about Darwin, because Darwin was a scientist and he could see that cooperation actually was beneficial to individuals and allowed for the survival of the fittest to work. So Kropotkin was like, Darwin said this. He based himself on Darwin. He referenced Darwin, the descent of man in particular. And it's a case of, it's like some people suggest that Kropotkin was like somehow anti-Darwin. Like, no, he wasn't. He explicitly based himself on Darwin's ideas. And Daniel Todd's book, Darwin Without Malthus, should be read by everybody who's interested in Kropotkin's ideas on evolution, because he places Kropotkin in the Russian evolutionary tradition and very clearly links Darwin and Kropotkin, and shows how Kropotkin himself built upon a commonplace Russian tradition which placed Darwin in a cooperative environment and recognised that the dog-eat-dog world of the sort of favoured by the sort of British Darwinists isn't the whole story, and Darwin himself wasn't so narrow.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I have a whole episode in the works on this that I'm gonna use some of Modern Science and Anarchy, as well as actually tell people what Malthus said and what Spencer said and what Huxley said, because if you click on social Darwinism on Wikipedia, it's like advocated by Spencer and Huxley, and Spencer and Huxley disagreed in these enormous ways, and now that their ideas have been aligned in a way that is just sloppy and lazy, and people either don't want to or don't have the time to sit down and read 19th century text, which I understand that, but maybe don't go around saying that Spencer and Huxley believe the same thing if you have read neither of them.
Yes, I mean Huxley himself is sort of somewhat misrepresented, because he was saying, he wasn't saying that we should invoke Darwinism. He was basically saying like dog eat dog. He was actually arguing that, well, let's not oppress the masses too much, because they won't work for us. We're all dead and all malnourished and stuff. He took the sort of the gladiatorial vision of nature, and basically said, "Oh, we have to be somehow, rise above our nature." And he never explains how that's possible.
Yeah,
and Kropotkin basically just mocks him by saying, like, well, essentially what you're saying is like God did it.
Yeah,
you're meant to be like, you're meant to be an evolutionist. You're meant to be like a materialist. You're meant to believe in natural selection, but ultimately you end up invoking some mysterious spirit, which means we overcome our nature. And he went, well, that's nonsense. Our nature is cooperative. The nature is also competitive. What wins out very much depends on the circumstances and our education and so forth. And Huxley just basically goes, oh, the magic fairy comes and we're all nice to each other. And you're like, okay, how does that work? And if it's a case of the people in power forcing us to be nice to each other, then like, well, surely by your own argument, the people in power are nasty, evil creatures. Why are they not doing this for themselves? So he just destroys his whole argument, and he presents a theory of natural selection to explain the rise of morality and ethics. And so, I mean, like, Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion has a chapter on the evolution of morality. And you think like, oh, that's only like about 100 years after Kropotkin was writing about it. It's like finally they caught up. And it's just like, yes, and that is like, so Kropotkin basically goes, but you're not actually natural scientists, you're not an evolutionist, you are not actually basing your ideas on a rigorous account of the facts. And you end up writing nonsense, and you end up invoking some sort of mysterious godlike spirit which transforms us somehow to make us ignore our nature. And so it's quite a joy reading them sort of taking this nonsense apart, particularly since this nonsense gets repeated all the time, even today. And you think like over 100 years later we'd learn to know rubbish when we read it, but no, it still gets regurgitated.
Yeah, I mean, the other person besides Darwin that is, my most recent episode, or one of my recent episodes, was about capitalism and Adam Smith, and just Adam Smith says big corporations are bad, and if you ever have big corporations, you can't have capitalism. So when people running around and say, oh well, we need big corporations because we just have to have capitalism, and Adam Smith said so, it's the same thing. These people have not read Adam Smith. They have a vague sense, and then they'll go on and write for the Wall Street Journal or whatever, but they clearly haven't read more than 200 words.
Yeah, if you read Adam Smith, he's quite aware of the limitations of capitalism, or what was of the elements of capitalism of his time, and in general he wasn't a fan. Yeah. It's just that he wasn't a fan, but he didn't like the mercantile structures in place even less.
Yeah.
And he's very critical of things like division of labour. He's very aware that the bosses had the advantage in terms of like strikes and so forth. And he basically says at one point, well, if a law is passed which is pro-labour, then that's a good thing because the bosses are basically influenced by politicians. Yeah. So if the politicians pass a pro-labour law, it must mean that it's a good thing.
Yeah.
And it's like,
try and convince the
you have to bear in
capitalists
mind that the reason why he was advocating sort of laissez-faire was because the rich influenced the politicians were elected by like 5% of the population. The rich is 5%. So anything they passed was in favour of the rich. So in the social context of the time, Adam Smith was basically saying, let's stop the rich distorting the market and crushing the poor. And that's the context of the time, and that's forgotten completely. And instead it's like, let's use Adam Smith to smash the poor. And you think, that's not really his argument. I think you're misunderstanding the social context and the bloody book you invoke. And he's a very important, I mean, Kropotkin like Adam Smith.
Yes.
Particularly his theories on sort of morality and sort of, but also he also mentioned Adam Smith positively in terms of economics as well, because he'd read them. And like a lot of there's not all these people he'd read Adam Smith. He was a very well educated man, and so it's like it's a case of Modern Science and Anarchy. It's like it's got a few positive references to Adam Smith because he knew what was going on. And one of the key arguments in Modern Science and Anarchy, like in Was of a Rebel, is that the state is used by the rich to enrich themselves, to secure the power and privilege in the property. And obviously we don't want to sort of empower the capitalist state because it's the capitalist state. It's a state run by and for capitalists. So empowering that means that you've got to sort of disempower the working class, and that's one of his key arguments. And there's elements of that in Adam Smith. Obviously, he didn't put it that way, but in terms of what he was arguing, stop the state intervening because the state's run by the top 5% of the population, and they're intervening to bolster their power, privileges, and property. So that's the context of Adam Smith, and it's still the context today. But Adam Smith is invoked by people who really haven't read him.
Yeah.
And, as you say, it's a case of the amount of times I've read stuff and you just go like, well, he didn't quite say that now, did he? About numerous authors. And it's just like, that's why it's important to read these things, because it's like the context is important. And Kropotkin was very influenced by, he was a man of his time. And obviously he read Adam Smith, he read other people, and that's reflected in all his works. And it's very clear that he's engaging with, the liberal tradition, like John Stuart Mill, Spencer, for example, and he's critiquing. He's drawing this he's basically saying, well, yes, they've got a point about this, but they forget about this, and he's exposing the sort of contradictions within liberalism, for example. He's saying, like, well, on one hand, they recognise the limitations of representative government, for example, but on the other hand, they defend property and defend, the state as the defender of property. Therefore, they end up in a contradiction. On the one hand, they want to minimise state intervention, but on the other hand, they have to support state intervention to keep the capitalist system going. And so, if they were actually true to their politics, then they would end up being socialists and end up truly abolishing state. And to be fair, John Stuart Mill did become a cooperative socialist, and he recognised the contradiction and he moved beyond liberalism. Spencer didn't. And Kropotkin spends a lot of time sort of pointing out his contradictions in Modern Science and Anarchy in particular. So he's very much engaged with the thinkers of his time. But one person he doesn't really engage with is Karl Marx, strangely enough, because very little of Karl Marx was actually published at the time. It's like, you had the Communist Manifesto, you've got another few pamphlets. In terms of, we just assume that everybody had the 50 volumes of the collected works. That's never been the case. For the bulk of the history of socialism, Marxism was basically one or two pamphlets, a few articles here and there, a few letters here and there. So he didn't really engage with Marx because there wasn't much to engage with. He engaged with the Social Democrats, the Marxists of his time, but in terms of thinkers, he didn't really bother with Marx because there wasn't much to critique. More a case of critiquing the dead end, which Marxist led the International into political action. That was one of his major things, and that comes out in Words of a Rebel, particularly in the articles on the labour movement, which I've added in this edition. And his argument is like all the way through is like, yes, by pursuing political action, by forming a political party which takes part in elections, you're drawing the labour movement into a dead end. You have to look at the direct struggle against capital. You have to look at economic struggle, sort of unions, strikes, occupations, and so forth. Forms of direct. It didn't call it direct action then, but forms of direct action, and movements based on direct action, which would bring you into conflict with the real power in society, which is of course capital. And so he was very much engaged with debating within the socialist movement which way forward, and drawing on the lessons of the First International to critique the Second International and ultimately the Third International, because he was around for that form. And so he had a very eventful 50 years in the movement.
So going back a bit to John Stuart Mill and liberalism, we do need to go forward and talk about the revolution that Kropotkin says is coming that maybe didn't quite come, because that's one part of the book that we need to get to. But this is partly for my listeners, Iain, and partly just for me, because there's a bit of Kropotkin that I feel like I read in your anthology, Direct Struggle Against Capital, but I can't find it. So we'll see if it exists or if you know it. I feel like somewhere he says something along the lines of the values or views of anarchism and liberalism are more or less the same, but that liberalism thinks it can sort of stop the process and anarchism goes all the way. Is that, have I invented this?
He makes a few comments along those lines. He basically says, anarchist communism, a pamphlet anarchist communism is principle, is basis in principles. He basically points out that it's two tendencies. There's the liberal tendency, which is sort of trying to minimise state intervention, and there's a socialist tendency, which is basically trying to get rid of property. And he said that anarchism is sort of, if you like, a combination of the two. But you have to bear in mind that that particular pamphlet was written for the liberal journal in the 19th century, so he's very much tailoring his argument to the audience. So in terms of, he was trying to address ideas which he knew the audience shared, and so sort of trying to put anarchism into that context, so his audience would go, right, home rule, so he's writing in a way which sort of draws out the possibility of conversion. He's clearly trying to convert people, and fair enough, and you have to take that opportunity. But he's also very clear that liberalism in itself hits this contradiction between sort of trying to minimise the state, but also trying to defend property and inequality and so forth. And he draws that out. He said basically your ideal of getting rid of the state or minimising the state will never happen as long as there's oppression and exploitation of the working classes, as long as there's property and inequalities of property. And he's basically similarly when he argues with socialists, when he says, well, yes, you want to create equality, you want to get rid of property, inequalities in property by socializing things, but you're keeping the state, and that's inequality of power. Yeah. And so he's drawing out the contradictions between state socialism and its aspirations and liberalism and its aspirations. He's not exactly saying that anarchism is sort of liberalism perfected. He's pointed out that yes, we have some ideas and some in common, but here's why you will reach a contradiction, and how you address this contradiction will determine where you go. And I think Spencer has used as an example of this, because Spencer, as he got older, became increasingly reactionary.
Yeah.
And so it's a case of, it's like you have a choice. Either you become consistent, and it says the same things to the socialists, state socialists. Either you become consistent and embrace anarchism and recognise that political power and economic power are intertwined. If you can't get rid of them, you either get rid of them both, or you have them both forever. And that's what he's pointing out to both the socialists, the state socialists, because obviously anarchists are socialists, state socialists, and the liberals. He's basically saying, you're almost there. Let me show you, where you go wrong. Let me show you the logical contradiction and where you can go forward and recognise, where you need to go. And in terms of those types of arguments, you have to bear in mind, you have to put them in the context of the audience he was writing for, because he doesn't write like that for things in the anarchist press. That sort of thing doesn't really get addressed because that's not the audience. So you have to bear in mind he's tailoring things for the audience he's writing for. But yes, you're right. He does say things along those lines, but purely in the sense of I'm trying to convert you to the cause, and I'm stressing the stuff stuff we have in common, so I can convince you to go the step forward and actually recognise the contradictions. And the thing about liberalism is, of course, is people look at liberalism now and project that back, but liberalism itself is quite a reactionary position. If you read people like Joseph Locke, for example, it's very much a case of ruled by the property owning elite, and if you're working class, you don't have all these rights. You basically just shut up and do what you're told. And so with liberalism, classical liberalism, and you can see that today, because you see people like Peterson, that phony so-called academic,
the Canadian guy,
Canadian guy who decided to sort of decided just to eat meat, and unsurprisingly enough, became constipated because we have evolved to be omnivores. You can't just survive on meat. You get constipated and you do bad things to yourself. That idiot. He calls himself a classical liberal, doesn't he? And it's he's got very reactionary authoritarian politics. He goes, yes, because classical liberalism's like that. The notion of liberalism being warm and fuzzy and nice and stuff is quite a recent development. If you read the liberals of the time, of Kropotkin's time, supported the Italian state when it was sort of shooting down workers in the street. Unarmed workers being shot. They were fine with that. They were fine with oppressive laws, because they recognised the state was there to protect property and to protect their power and privileges. That was liberalism at the time, and so we have to bear that in mind too. So he was very much tailoring things to the audience, and but yes, he did say something along those lines, but not quite.
Yeah, but I mean, I will say, like, I do think that this is the perfect move. I mean, I also interested in conversion, given the number of people in the States, at least, who are left adjacent and interested in something and interested in more radical options, and they're flocking to people like Bernie Sanders and AOC and the DSA, all of which are things that I certainly prefer to what is currently happening in America. But then it does seem to me that it's like, hey, yeah, you and I want the same thing, and but there is a contradiction in your reasoning that you would be quite happy if, say, the Supreme Court delivered democratic socialism, or if an imperial president delivered democratic socialism. And has it ever occurred to you that if a president could deliver democratic socialism, they could also deliver fascism? So if you are really anti-fascist, you can't go down this road. That's the move that Kropotkin is making that I want to make.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I've never been one for sort of splendid isolation in terms of the anarchist movement. It's like, I remember once I was on a demo in London when I lived in London, and it was an anarchist fair, but we're all like masked up in a little cluster, making no attempt to interact with anybody around them. And it's just like, you're on a march. These people are like questioning things, and you are not trying to get them interested in anarchism. Other than look at those weirdos over there with the masks on and the black flags. It's just like, you're missing an opportunity here. And anarchism is, if it's anything, is a movement of the people, and you have to basically win people over. And that's Kropotkin's position. It's always been my position. And I don't believe in splendid self-isolation, because ultimately you end up being a cranky old guy who raves and rants about everything. And it's just like, including your own comrades. And it's just like, who try to do something. And it's just like, yeah, okay, you do that, and I'll get on with more important stuff. Yeah, but you're right. We have to make allies, and yes, people who are in favour of Bernie Sanders. It's like here, it's a case of you got the Tory party, you got the Labour Party. People who are in the Labour Party will be closer to anarchism than the people in the Tory party. Full stop. And it's a case of you have to recognise they got limited time and resources, so you try to convince people who are closest to you, because that requires the least work. So that's my perspective, and I think I think Kropotkin's very much that case. He presents critiques of things. He draws out to what audience he's addressing himself to. He draws out what we have in common, where we differ, and why you should no longer differ and reject those particular points of view and come over and sort of embrace the cause. And he's very successful. He is one of the best writers, and he did win a lot of people over to anarchism thanks to his writings. So it's something to build on. Definitely something to build on. Not perfect, but definitely solid foundations.
Yeah, and particularly appeal to the young, which is a chapter in this book. It really, I mean, look, I have an academic background. I've taught a lot of young people in elite circumstances, and the vast majority of them say something like, I'm going to become a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor in order to change the world and make it a better place. And Kropotkin really argues he would say revolution, but you could also just say enormous transformation, revolution, enormous transformation, whatever. Doctors and lawyers and engineers, even the quote good ones, even the ones working for quote social justice, they cannot make a difference. I mean, they cannot make a true difference. They cannot do anything but serve reactionary causes, because they're integrated into reactionary systems. And that's a blow to the sort of liberal democratic Obama, Tony Blair style. Like, let's just get some good people in the good positions, and hey, they're gonna blow up a few Middle Eastern people, but that's just the price you pay, and we'll make it better in the system.
Well, that's what Kropotkin said. Is like all the socialists who talk about the conquest of power. It's one of the titles of one of his articles, which has never been translated into English. Well, it has been, but recently I did it. But it's like, but conquest of power, but power conquers you. It's like, you end up being part of a system you try to transform. And if it's like, and people say like, oh, the anarchist movement's small. It's like, yes, okay, the anarchist movement's small, but like the Labour Party or the left wing of Democrats, assuming that's that left wing, you think like, okay, they're bigger, But we're not socialist. We're not aiming for a transformation of society. We're aiming for wee tweaks here and there to make it like slightly better. And that's it. It's like, okay, fine. Yeah, there's more people willing to do that. Fine, but you have to bear in mind that's not enough. And we have to win that case, and we have to win the argument. And it's a case of maybe with the Corbyn situation where we saw the bureaucracy of the Labour Party basically destroy the party rather than have sort of a slightly radical politician, somebody who would be considered mainstream in the 70s.
Yeah.
And it's like he's like, oh, the coming of the Antichrist. And so it's like, look, even your own party bureaucracy worked to undermine him. Maybe it's time to think, well, maybe change doesn't come through Parliament. Maybe change won't come through the Labour Party. And you'll be banging your head against a brick wall for quite a long time. And we've had 12 years of the Tories. We've had so many elections. It's just like, okay, you have the idea about it'll come through Parliament. Like, we're still waiting. The Labour Party's been around the yonks. Are we near a socialism than we were like in Kropotkin's time? Probably not. We've got some state ownership, some state intervention, but capitalism's still going, inequality's still rising, social mobility's still dropping. So it's like maybe it's time for a rethink. Yeah, we are. Kropotkin's got this chapter in Was of Rebel called Revolutionary Minorities, and he makes the point. Yes, we are a minority. We don't deny it. Every movement starts off as a minority. It's whether or not we chime with wider tendencies or not when we'll grow. And I think we still do chime with the tendencies. Our analysis is still valid. Our solution is still valid. We just have to work out how best to apply those ideas. And we have to bear in mind the state itself has been working hard to stop us being able to apply those ideas. It's so it was like in Britain, for example, the Tories who go like, oh, we're minimal state, we don't believe in bureaucracy, we want to cut red tape. They have passed law upon law regulating trade unions, making it hard to go and strike, making it hard to do anything. And this is a case of, they've been intervening, they're using the state to intervene to undermine popular struggles because they know that power lies outside Parliament and they act to keep that power minimised. Because, it's like they don't have, anti-Labour laws. The anti-Labour laws they have is not directed against the Labour Party, it's directed against trade unions and protest. They're currently putting through laws which will make, actual marches and so forth harder. And then basically, if you're too noisy, you can be arrested. That's a law they're putting in. And I did say to my family, it's like Putin's missing a trick when he's crushing the anti-war movement in Russia. He should say, oh no, they're perfectly entitled to protest against the war. It's just being too noisy. Because that's literally the law they're passing in Britain to stop people getting together to get a sense of a collective strength, and they're using the state to break that power. Because they're still scared of us, even now, after being in charge for like 30, 40 years, they're still aware of the power of ordinary people to change things, and they're still scared of it, and they're still passing laws to make it harder.
Yeah, they prove every time they pass a law like that how powerful we could be.
Exactly.
Brings me now to this idea of, I said transformation instead of revolution because I'm a little leery of the word revolution, in part because of how it functions in this book, Kropotkin. So I would say this book, the analysis of this book, holds up incredibly well in 2022. And yet this claim that Kropotkin makes, at one point he says it will be within 10 years. He says everything he sees is moving towards the revolution. He wrote this book, or he wrote the articles that became this book, in a mode that was not just optimistic for a revolution, but an analysis that suggested a revolution in an almost Marxist way was almost inevitable, or at least was building. And we certainly, perhaps World War I and the rise of fascism and totalitarianism was the thing that he saw coming. He saw the earthquake coming, or the volcano, but it certainly was not the anarcho-communist revolution or socialist revolution that he saw. So I'm wondering how we can think about this book that, for all its insight, seems to have gotten one thing very wrong, or at least it's complicated in a way that I haven't worked through for myself yet.
Oh yeah, he has to, yeah. Kropotkin addresses this in the Italian preface of 1904. And he basically says, when I was writing this, obviously we thought it would be a revolution in 10 years. And Marx and Engels said the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, when I became an anarchist way back in like 1987, I was pretty confident it'd be like, 5-10 years max. Because you read these ideas, you go like, wow, all we have to do is tell people about it, and they'll go like, yeah, because
it's so
anyway,
obvious.
yeah, it doesn't work like that, does it? So he addresses that issue in 1904 preface. He basically says, basically the reaction after the Franco-Prussian War, he underestimated that. That was the key thing. He was saying. Also, kind of draws out his anti-Prussian, anti-German sort of tendencies, which came out later on. But he did address that issue, and you have to bear in mind, though, that like the following year, 1905, saw the revolution in Russia. So the revolution did break out in Russia. Obviously, and you have to also have to bear in mind that this period we're talking about, like 1877, 1879, 77 onwards, they were quite massive strikes, they were quite massive protests and so forth. There were things that were going on which we forget about now, but at the time was like, wow, these were like mass movements, like insurrectionary movements, so general strikes and going on, breaking out all the time. So you have to bear in mind that these were things going on which were definitely going. Things are actually going to things could happen. And part of the problem, and Kropotkin discusses this as well, is that the labour movement itself was shunted into a dead end. Instead of it being based on sort of direct action, it got shunted into parliamentarianism. And to a degree, I can understand why, because obviously building a political party, telling people to vote every 5 years, and basically that's it. That's easy to do. Building a union, building a community group, actually conducting sort of direct action things is difficult, and keeping that momentum going is difficult. And what's easier than just going, okay, we'll vote for the leader, and the leader will get into parliament, and the leader will argue our case for us, and we don't have to really do very much. And it's understandable, but sort of sometimes people take the easy option. It's a dead end, but at the time you can go like, okay, yeah, let's give it a go. But so yes, he was optimistic, and his optimism was very much. I think you have to be an optimist to be an anarchist, because otherwise, how can you be a pessimistic anarchist? But at the same time, we forget about the general strikes. We forget about the sort of in Spain, for example, it's like regular sort of insurrections and so forth that broke out more or less spontaneously. We forget about all that. We just see the big events. And Kropotkin's, we read like the Rebel and Revolt, the two papers. Well, the first one was obviously where Words of the Rebel came from. There's articles in sort of the social movement where things like general strikes, things like insurrections and so forth, things like in Austria, for example, like miners went into the local city and just basically took what they wanted because they were on strike and they were starving. They just went and took stuff, and that's been chronicled in the paper. So there are events going on which are basically contributing to the idea that something's going to happen. And Kropotkin does say, yes, we were too optimistic, and we underestimated certain factors like, the reaction after the Franco-Prussian War, and obviously the dead end of socialism, sort of the parliamentary road, which dissipated a lot of struggles. But there were things going on. I mean, like 1877, for example, just before Kropotkin, 2 years before Kropotkin launched the Rebel. There was in America the Great Railway Strike. And that basically saw strikers more or less fighting with the state forces, seizing like areas, like vast areas of the country. And it's like Kropotkin's like it's like pointing to that as some lessons to be learned from that. He talks about that in there. He talks about sort of strikes in Austria. He like links it to what's going on. And yes, obviously, but I think for Kropotkin, he stresses this a lot, particularly in his later writings and letters and so forth. It's like the key factor is the militant minority, the sort of anarchists being there and proposing ideas to people and saying, no, we should do this, we should do that. And the role of actual, revolutionary minorities, which transforms these revolts into something a bit more substantial. And hopefully, hopefully they fail, they keep a legacy in terms of movements. So those sort of, like in Spain or in Italy, when sort of the labour movement eventually became like in Spain, the anarchist labour movement became the CNT eventually. And that legacy continues and was built upon. And he was arguing that like the role of anarchists is quite important. This doesn't happen by itself. And the role we have to learn is like, how do we apply ideas now so that any tendencies and any revolts that do happen, any social movements that do arise, we go in a positive direction and don't get sidetracked into dead ends like parliamentarianism. And so that was very important. And he just stressed that a lot as a case of, yes, I was very optimistic, but at the same time, there's a lot going on to justify that optimism. And ultimately, the reason why is that, it's our fault, in a sense, the anarchist movement's fault for not being part of the people. And that was one of his great motifs, one of his great sort of arguments. And it's like, go to the people. Because initially he was part of the Russian populist movement, very much go to the people. And that was his argument. Malatesta made the same point. There's a case of, we have to be in popular movements. We have to be in a union. We have to be active in a union. We have to be active in the community groups. Like during the poll tax movement, anti-poll tax movement in Britain, like 1987 onwards, anarchists played a big role in that. And that was unfortunately moved into the dead end of parliamentarianism, thanks to militant social Trotskyists, essentially, who Scottish Socialist Party eventually, and that was based on community organisation, direct action in terms of stopping people sheriff officers going and taking people's furniture for unpaid bills, unpaid community charge bills. And it was all very much direct action, solidarity, community organisation, built a federation across all Britain, and it was wasted. It disappeared, but in favour of electing Thomas Sheridan to be into the Scottish Parliament. And it's just like, that was a great opportunity. I think Han Gay Solidarity Group still goes, and that's an example of what could have happened across Britain, but instead it was like, it wasn't enough anarchists. The anarchists were too small and maybe too hesitant about arguing their ideas strongly, maybe because you don't want to come across as trots, and you can understand why you don't want to come across as a robotrop, but at the same time you still have to argue your case. Not to do that means letting other people do it. So yes, he was optimistic, but as I say, he had cause for being optimistic, and he did address the issue of why the revolution didn't break out in the 1904 preface of the Italian edition, which is in this edition. But you also have to remember about a year later, the Russian Revolution broke out, and that influenced, across the world. And yes, you're right, revolution has had, Russian Revolution failed. Produced the Bolshevik dictatorship. And it's a case of, yes, you can be hesitant about it. You can be wary about it because revolutions have not succeeded. Either they were crushed or they turned into, in the case of Russia, something worse than what it was to begin with, which is pretty impressive. Considering we're talking about Tsarism. But that's the point, though, is the potential was there. And if you look in the Russian case, the Makhnovists in the Ukraine, they were fighting against the red and white dictatorship. By no means were they perfect, but they did offer the potential of something better. And that's what you should always remember. Revolutions kind of break out without anybody wanting them to, and unexpectedly. And it's a case of, if it does happen, then you have to be part of the movement. And the Kropotkin stresses this all the time, so that when it does happen, you're there to sort of push it in the right direction towards a liberation rather than a new boss. And unfortunately, in Russia, you read some of the stuff, resolutions and so forth. I was reading a thing about factory committees, and the guy comments something along the lines of, and the people were so, sure that, the state would be always in their side. They didn't put any things about, recall and so forth. And you think, yeah, that's a problem because, they had been convinced by Bolsheviks that, well, we get a worker state, then it will represent the workers. We don't have to worry about it too much. And I was that mentality was well, power was abused. and deliberately so a lot of the time. So you read some of the stuff Trotsky wrote, it's just going like, oh my God,
it's amazing.
I know, he's just like, and it's like, and so it's a case of, you built structures which were later perverted the revolution because you didn't listen to Kropotkin, you didn't listen to Bakunin, who predicted exactly what was going to go wrong and did. It's like, you read like the Great French Revolution and you go like, yeah, then you read this, but I don't think he took it on heart. It didn't quite work out the lessons Kropotkin was so strongly advocating, and you made all the mistakes the Jacobins made because you don't recognise that Jacobins were actually essentialists and aiming for minority rule, i.e. the bourgeoisie. And you thought, well, they had the right idea, essentialism, but it'll be for the workers, it'll be for the masses. Nope, the structures you put in place for minority rule created minority rule and created a new minority in power, a new ruling class, a new bureaucracy, and it's a case of Kropotkin wouldn't be surprised because he predicted that Bakunin wouldn't be surprised, Malthus and so forth. And that's the thing, though, it's like, even today, you just sit there thinking, like, why are we having these arguments with Marxists? Because we were right, you were wrong. We don't have, it's like evolutionary theory. We don't have debates between Darwinists and Lamarckians because Darwin was proved right. It's like, in terms of social science, how many times do you have to keep doing the same thing over and over again and still coming out with the same bad result before you admit maybe we were wrong? Because we've got 150 years of experience, over 150 years of experience, and you think like we can draw some conclusions from this 150 odd years of experience. And the conclusions were Kropotkin was right, Bakunin was right, Marx was wrong, Lenin was wrong, Engels was wrong. Not saying we didn't have any insights, not saying we're wrong about anything. I'm just saying in terms of our strategies, we've got 150 years plus now. We can safely say, but who was right, who was wrong? I would say.
No, I could not agree with you more, Iain, and that's why I was always looking for something in American pragmatism or something, because I knew Marxism was wrong. I mean, I hadn't found anarchism as a road until recently, but it's obvious that Marxism was wrong. I'm with you. I don't know why. I mean, by all means, keep reading Walter Benjamin and people like that. And of course, there's very interesting stuff written by Marx and Engels. But yeah, I don't know why we still have Marxists. I really don't. Who knows?
I don't know either. And it's like, if you really wanted to stay a Marxist, you become a council communist. At least you're in the right area. It's like you don't have to be like, Trotskyism and stuff. It's like, how can you still be Trotskyist? Considering it's like the more you find out about what that Lenin and Trotsky did in power, the more of a notion that it's because of the Civil War, because of its isolation and so forth, it caused the rise of Stalin. You just go, no, it's like, the nations were built by the Bolsheviks before the Civil War started. The Civil War and isolation made things worse, undoubtedly, concentrated the power more, but the path was already there. Yeah, and it's a case of and the path was predicted by the anarchists, and he said, look, if you go down this route, this is what's going to happen. If you went down that route, it happened. And Kropotkin was obviously he's writing in the 1919 postscript to Was the Rebel. He talks about the Russian experience, and he's pointing out if you have a centralized structure and you have a few people in charge, you're never going to be able to solve the problems any real revolution or any real society would have. It's just not going to happen. And the conquest of bread is very strong in that too. And it's a case of you need popular participation, you need federalism, you need decentralization, you need sort of dynamic structures, because life is complicated and you don't know what's going to happen. And if you wait for the people in charge to do it, then you're going to be waiting a long time. And anybody who's done a job knows that waiting for the boss to decide something, it's like, well, okay, I better go and do it because he's never going to make a mind up. Same with politicians. It's like wait for politicians. It's like during the COVID thing, the COVID initial months of the COVID crisis here. People and companies and individuals are volunteering to make PPE, protection equipment for the nurses and so forth. And the government tried to sort of organise that, and it just went into dead end. It just disappeared into the bureaucracy. And it's like, yeah, you wait for the bureaucracy or wait for the bosses to do something, you're going to have a long wait. And the Kropotkin's very clear on that. You have to act for yourself, you have to act locally, you have to federate, you have to take the initiative. And that's one of his things he always stressed. Like, he always used the word men of initiative, obviously reflecting the language of the time. But people of initiative, people taking the action, sort of going like, here's a problem, let's try this. And that's what any revolution needs, or any social movement needs. It's this dependency on like leaders to act for us. Again, will get you killed. COVID, for example. If you waited for the politicians to act, a lot more people would have died, because that's what happened in Britain. Boris Johnson dithered and waited, and there's like the local coffee shop. They went into lockdown like 2 weeks before the government decided to do it, and it's like the local coffee shop had the right idea, and more people had to do that. And it's just like, yes. So yeah, Kropotkin's arguments in terms of he looks back on the words of a rebel and the 1919 afterward, and draws out the conclusion of the lessons of the Russian Revolution, and which fits in exactly with the analysis of the conquest of bread and other parts of the words of a rebel.
Okay, I think that's a wonderful place to end, except I do want to take a moment to ask you about the art on the cover. I'm blanking on the artist's name, but I know that they've illustrated a number of these Kropotkin editions, and they're just exquisite.
Oh, yeah, lovely. Yes. The illustrated Mutual Aid, for example, that's a lovely book. I only say, like, why did you exclude the introduction? By the way, yes, it's lovely, and it's like it's a very nice picture. And I think the same guy did the Great French Revolution too.
Yes.
My only thing about with the picture, well, it's lovely. It does kind of reinforce the anarcho Santa, like Bushy Beard and stuff. It's a minor point. It's a lovely. I like a cover. It's a nice cover. But obviously, I think it's like it's definitely when he's a lot older than when he actually wrote
the book. Yeah,
because when he was in his 30s then, late 20s, early 30s. So it's like the beard wasn't quite so bushy, the hair wasn't quite so so now. But yeah, the edition's lovely. It looks really nice, and its presentation's half a battle. People have when you pick something up, if it looks nice, then people will more likely read it than if it's like a dog's dinner.
Yeah, and I think this is, if you're out there listening to this and you've maybe read a little Kropotkin on the internet or whatever, but you're looking to start somewhere, this particular edition, it's got appeal to the young in it. It's beautiful. Iain has done a wonderful job with the introduction. I mean, this is a nice place to start with Kropotkin. Or go right ahead.
I should say, if you've got the Black Rose 1992 edition, I would also say that this new edition has got a lot of material, supplementary material in it, which you won't have. And it has the introductions, as well as it has the prefaces and postfaces. And it has a comprehensive glossary and footnotes, endnotes, and so forth. So it's a substantial. You will gain something from getting this if you already have the 1992 edition, because that wasn't complete and the translation was a bit dodgy in places. So I'm sure PM Press will be happy that I said that. But honestly, like it's like when I was doing the editing, I was thinking I have to make sure that there's reason for people who've got the 1992 edition to consider buying this one, and it is substantially more material in it which you have not seen before. Some of it's in direct struggle against capital, but some of it's a new translation in this one. But so there's material there you have not seen before. Either new translations of existing stuff or completely new translations. And as I say, it's a complete edition. It's got all the prefaces and afterward, and it's got some very long footnotes, which weren't included in the 1992 edition.
And I'll say again, if it looks like a big tome to you, if you're thinking, oh no, I don't, I'm interested in Kropotkin, I'm interested in anarchism, but I don't want to read a long, thick book. It is a series of newspaper articles. You can read one and put it down and pick the book up again in a month. It is delightful. I would say, put put it by your bed or on your coffee table and just pick it up whenever you have 5 minutes. And that is actually a wonderful. Yeah. I do not recommend reading Kant that way, but you can certainly read this book that way. And it's
a selection of articles and most pamphlets. All combined, so you can just dip in and out and sort of pick it up and put it down again without too much hassle. It's not one of these, it's not like Capital where you have to sort of start at page 1 and plow your way through. It's like it's bite-sized with the occasional large chunk. That's for pamphlets. But but mostly pamphlets. There's a few pamphlets, but mostly articles. But as I say, it's a wide ranging, and you'll find something of interest in it. And it's a very good book. It's just a shame it's taken so long for the complete edition to actually arrive, because I was excited when I saw the 1992 version, because it's like finally. It's only been since 1885, but now that definitive edition's there. So, and also if you're interested, obviously you can compare what he argues in Words of a Rebel, his first book, to Modern Science and Anarchy, which was the last book published in his lifetime, and you can see the continuity and change. Because obviously there's a lot of things which are pretty much the same, but some of the emphasis is different, and it's interesting to compare and contrast. Not that I'm trying to get people to. I don't get royalties, so I'm not trying to. I'm a worker. I get in a pay packet, so it's like not a case I'm trying to boost up my royalty sales. I wouldn't have done these. I wouldn't have worked on these books if I didn't think they were a contribution to the movement and something which is important for one, understanding Kropotkin, but also for anarchists today to learn from. And it's a case of read these books, but read them critically, because Kropotkin would have been the last person in the world to say regurgitate. You would have said, read this stuff, think about how it applies to you, change what you need to change, and apply what you need to apply. It's a foundational text, and it's to be built upon. It's not to be worshipped at. And I think that's the message to be taken. It's a case of these are contributions. They're obviously contributions written in the 1879 to 1882. Times have changed, but also a lot of continuity still. We're still in the capitalist, still under the state. It's a case of these are tools which you can use to build a movement of today. A foundation and a tool set, if you like, and it's what we can use to build something better now.
Okay. Thank you, Iain. Thank you for doing all this work you've done with Kropotkin and other writers, and thank you for joining me on Everyday Anarchism. This was wonderful.
Well, I'm happy to. If you want me back, can always do Proudhon sometime.
Yeah, well, yes, I will let you know. Without a doubt, I would love to have you back on. Right now, I'm a little under the gun with everything that's going on, but you will be hearing from me without a doubt.
Well, thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable. Take care.
Bye, Iain.
Bye.
Thank you.